So our next speaker is Elke Haege Thorvaldson. Elke is a co-author of the award-winning publication Soils for Landscape Development. Together with soil scientist Simon Leake, Elke was awarded an Australian Institute of Landscape Architecture Award in 2014 and an Australian Institute of Horticulture Award in 2015, both in research and literature and contributions to the industry. Elke was awarded a fellowship to the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects in 2022. She will be discussing soil design and the soil volume simulator. Let's welcome Elke.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for coming. I'll just wait for the presentation to come up. And thanks for the introduction, and also, if I don't get the opportunity, thanks to City Green for putting on such an amazing event. So it was actually about 10 years ago that Simon Leake and I, through CSIRO, published Soils for Landscape Development. And we wanted to improve the industry standard and approach to soils in the landscape developments. And part of that was we introduced 13 product specifications for soils. It was the first time that a soil specification was a product specification, and that's sort of opposed to a recipe style specification. So it outlined target ranges in chemical and physical properties with example components that might likely meet those physical or that might meet the physical and the chemical properties for the soil supplier, as well as the first component, which was a bit of a description or a performance descriptor. These specifications, it was published 2014 and then again reprinted in 2018, and they're also available as an online download. But the book also introduced the soil design approach method, which challenges the designer and landholder to understand that site soil is an asset. The method prompts the designer to think about where the soil resources are coming from, the transport needed, and encourages the use of site soil. Soil resources include mined materials that are the mineral components such as sand, silt and clay. These photos are from a Sydney creek bed which is currently being used, mined or dredged by a large soil supplier in Sydney, in Western Sydney. The soil design approach method has 6 steps from optimal to least optimal. From using existing site soil being the optimal, and obviously in some cases that's not possible, to ameliorating the site soil if you can, or improving some of the site soil, or even adding to the existing site soil to improve it. And then there might be some locations in your project that you can retain some of that soil, or you might need to import a little bit of soil into some of the some specific locations in the site project. And finally, the least preferable but sometimes unavoidable option, and generally the default option up until more recently. I'm seeing a lot of change now, which is great. That sort of 90s and early 2000s approach was just to import new site soil. Today we do it for things like green roofs and green walls and vaulted landscapes. So yeah, there's still absolutely a need for it. Apologies for that little cartoon soil truck zooming across the screen. It's incredibly cheesy, but I want to hopefully remind you about the transport cost and associated environmental costs of transport to and from site if you're importing soil, and also think about the tipping fees. Soil goes to landfill, it has to get treated as contaminated, as well as have a think about the transport within, if you've got a large project, the truck movements across the site, and about where the stockpile of your soil might be, if that's what you're going to do, and where you might be able to save some of the existing site soil. During construction, management of landscape areas can be really critical, and they can also save cost and time. So inducting contractors properly, this is a site of one of my projects, I think quite a few years ago. And I just happened to be doing a site visit on the day that the concrete truck decided to wash its empty concrete into my future beautiful garden bed. So instead of being able to reuse this subsoil, we had to remove the subsoil that had to get, or the subgrade that had to get taken off to landfill, and then new subsoil and new topsoil put in. It would have, obviously that's not the best case scenario, but it would have been a much worse case if this hadn't been picked up and that plants got thrown in, and then the plants would have failed to thrive and or died after a year or more. The builders would have long left the site since then, and so maybe the rectification would never have occurred anyway. How can we avoid this sort of stuff? Fencing and physical barriers can be useful to protect the soil zone. We can retain landscape areas on site and exclude construction contamination. Avoiding having to replant this zone in this photo is also less costly to the developer. Philip mentioned undisturbed soil networks as well, which is another key driver. So that photo you previously saw, this is during construction, and it's a really large shopping centre development, and this, if we hadn't fenced this area off, it would have also been completely contaminated with site contamination or construction contamination. Other protection can include mulch, ground protection boards, such as where you've got scaffolding, you can put some ground protection boards under. Where you want to stop migration of construction waste, such as silt and dust barriers, shade cloth, erosion and sediment control barriers, such as sandbags or hay bales, and then diversion of contaminated site waste during construction, both liquid and dry. Or in larger zones, you can do some hydroseeding, and also there's the stockpiling. So in 2014, Simon and I, also through this book, Soils for Landscape Development, we first developed and introduced a recommended minimum soil volume estimator. This was the first time that more than one or two factors were combined to consider soil volumes for trees. And just to preface, this is for urban trees. We're not talking about in areas that have, forested areas and things like that. We're talking about trees that are in limited spaces. So we introduced these 8 key factors, or interlinked key factors, for evaluating the minimum soil volumes. And these all appeared in that appendix of Soils for Landscape Development, where we discuss, amongst other things, the awareness that we need in the application and the dangers of scientific rules being applied to biological systems. So you'll notice that I won't ever use the word calculator, because it's not a formula, it's not a mathematical formula that we can use. We have to always be really considerate about trees have biological systems, they are living organisms. I'm sure Dr. Kim Liu will touch on the fact that we are living beings, and there's not just a one-size-fits-all type of tablet that we can take and we'll all be fixed. So this estimator has evolved since 2014, and it's evolved to be much more user-friendly, which Ross will be happy about, and it's now online and freely available with a series of drop-down menus. It's now being used across the industry and in regulatory documents in Australia and internationally. We looked at 11 key pieces of previous primary scientific research findings, and 12 scientific recommendations, which we summarised and outlined in Soils for Landscape Development in the book. The research comes predominantly from studies in Europe, the Netherlands, Southeast England, USA, and some of the research just concentrates on one tree species. Tree size definitions were also really good consideration in assessing all of this research. Out of this, the 1992 Lindsay and Basuk research, it is the first time that shared trenches is mentioned, which is again talking about that connected soil networks. And that was introduced with their research really concentrating around tree evaporation and wind throw. Of the 16, so 15 international and 1 Australian, so of the 16 regulatory or authority recommendations, and we looked at landscape guidelines and landscape standards, in 2007 was the first time tree ratio to car park numbers was introduced, thinking about Gwilym and Ross's photos of trees in car parks. Most of these documents are not referenced, these landscape standard documents. Most of them are from Canada and the USA. And the tree sizing that they quote is really varied. So generally these recommendations seem to be a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach, no matter the tree species. What we saw as the danger was that the regulated minimum soil volumes could run the risk of reducing the number of trees being planted. So even so, all these documents were really useful in discussions that Simon and I had about trees that we knew about and planted and watched grow, defying all of these rules, all of these volumes that were being quoted, as well as looking at applying these volumes to real-life examples in the Australian context, and the concepts of deliberate and acceptable stunting. So generally the authority documents were the same or less than the recommended volumes in the primary research, except for the Australian example, which you can see there. This seemed to recommend a large volume about 3 times greater than the largest soil volume that's recommended in any of the other research or the landscapes guidelines. So in the 2014 version, this generated a results chart and a recommendations chart or graph, but we wanted to make this method much more user-friendly, and we wanted it to become a quick, ready reference tool for the industry. And in 2017, we launched the Soil Volume Simulator, which you feel free to Google it. You can either Google Soil Volume Simulator or Elke Soils, and it should come up. I will run through what it looks like, so you don't need to. The danger we could see was that we still wanted to advocate for planting trees, particularly large native trees. This soil volume simulator needed to accommodate for tree stunting in lieu of no tree being planted at all. We have all observed trees growing in available soil volumes that are much less in volume than the commonly recommended soil volumes from the literature. So by providing this soil volume simulator, we hope it will encourage tree planting and not the opposite. Yes, that car at Bunnings is parked in a rare bit of shade in the car park, but perhaps they should have checked the line marking better. Better still, more trees in the car park might have provided some safer parking options. For the most part, trees will stunt according to the volume of soil and hence water and nutrients available to them, and yet still provide adequate function as a street tree. We introduced the use of design size at 15 to 20 years, which I'll talk about in a moment, to allow for the fact that a stunted tree might provide a perfectly adequate design response as intended, or not, as you can see in these photos. And so these stunted trees will never fulfill the design intent or provide shade or canopy cover or reduce the urban heat island effect as intended. Does everyone know that those trees at Woolloomooloo, just next to the naval base? Yeah, I think they've been there maybe 50 years. They're fig trees. And then there are the exceptions that defy all odds and are truly wonderful contributors to our urban habitat. The findings we learnt were the more appropriate and adequate the soil zone for a tree, the higher value of the tree, the lower cost for maintenance and replacement frequency, the greater the efficiency and performance of the tree, and the more it contributes to the urban ecosystem, and shorter time that it takes for the tree to reach its potential, which is quite important with all the canopy targets that we're trying to meet. The smaller the soil volume zone, the more susceptible the tree is to climatic stresses such as drought and flood and nutrient deficiency. The life expectancy of the tree is significantly reduced and its pest and disease resilience low, as it may be stunted and may provide poor amenity and less shade. The tree is also less healthy and more likely to be unsafe structurally and unstable. This is what the soil volume simulator looks like on the website. So there's 3 parts to it. This soil volume simulator is the first of its kind to introduce design size and height with 5 options. There are drop-down menus to each of these, and I've just pulled them out to show you. With the design size height at being 15 to 20 years, this is opposed to what developers might Google and find out what the tree height is going to be, yet it's a tree height in a forest with no impacts to it, and then you have to explain to the developers that no, the tree does not grow to 40 metres in this circumstance. So that's actually a really good tool, this soil volume simulator, to help explain that. So this also differentiates between the tall, slender species that we have, such as some of the eucalypts or Agathis robusta or Araucaria, versus a more squat or umbrageous species like the large ficus or Magnolia grandiflora. We've also got climate growing conditions to the trees, which the climate combines the tree's resilience versus the climatic growing condition that you're in, particularly rainfall. So the selections are related to both that climate and the tree's natural characteristics, or what it prefers with rainfall. We also have soil suitability within the tree pit. There we go. Ranging from not very fertile soil to an optimum soil media that's being used. Also in this one it accounts for if you're doing on podium or on slab areas. Then there's the maintenance component. So if you're planning to have from no maintenance or very little maintenance up to a really good amount of maintenance, and this also combines if you've got irrigation occurring as well, or passive irrigation. And then the last one in this part is it's considering tree lifespan and replanting or replacement time. And this is a really good prompter at the design phase to sort of help dictate whether you can have a reduced soil volume. So if you're having a short lifespan or turnover of a tree, you can reduce the amount of soil that you need. On the flip side, if you're expecting over 99 years from your tree, you're going to need some larger soil volumes. Think of the pantry of food that you might need for a short time versus a long time. That's sort of what the tree requirements are as well. So then there's part 2, which introduces connecting or bridging to nearby soil zones and the consideration of shared root zones. The drop-down options consider the surface conditions as well as the soil conditions. So that's the surface conditions from impervious down to pervious, and then we've got the next one, which is the soil conditions, which are outside the tree pit. So if you're planting in a zone next to a lawn that is growing really well and has good drainage, then you're going to have relatively good soil conditions outside the tree pit itself. This stimulates the effectiveness and quality of the tree's ability to utilise the surrounding soils. And then it just gives you an option to plug in what that situation is going to be for your scenario. What would that look like? So the tree on the far right image and the tree on the far left, but the one on the far left in the foreground, they have little to no available soil outside the tree pit, whereas the image in the middle shows available tree rooting soil under the turf, as well as the loose unit pavers for air and water exchange. And then that tree that we were looking on the far left, that's about 35 at a very conservative estimate years old, not really providing much shade. And these trees, and also in the eastern part of Sydney, whereas the two photos on the right are Richardson Road, Springs Farm project. And yeah, sure, maybe it's not the ideal volume of soil, but after 6 years they're already starting to provide some shade through their linked rooting systems, etc. So then the third part of the soil volume simulator, there's only 3 parts, and this third part is not necessarily compulsory. It considers the shared root systems. Soil volumes can reduce per tree when you're multiplying or planting multiple trees in the same connected, uninterrupted soil planting zones, such as the linked soil networks. This relates to the ability of the trees to share and allocate nutrients, oxygen and water, as well as sugars through photosynthesis by mostly connecting fine roots and mycorrhizal systems. The connected trees can also send out warning signals when there's pest or disease attack or poison via tree hormone chemical response, as the tree can tap into and draw upon a larger area. So in this way, the group of trees can be more resilient and a greater buffer to factors such as drought and poor soil nutrition. This, I might just flip back 2 slides. So see that in the green boxes you get I can't really read it from here, but the soil recommended minimum soil volume for the number of trees selected. So you can show the reduction, whereas I'll just flip back again. So the first part, if we can go back. Here we go. So that green box down the bottom gives a total recommended soil volume. Just for this example, it's 8.65. Then of the options we selected for this second part, it said you could reduce the soil volume within the tree pit by 50%, takes it down to about 4.3 or so. And then when you plug in the shared root systems, we've only put in one shared root system here, but so it gives then the 8.7 being for one tree, this is the volume you need, and then it also says the percentage of the soil volume that you can attribute to the external area. The designer can select whether they're going to have a greater number of trees in a space, or maybe select for one really large umbrageous tree, which is what that diagram behind was. I think I might be overworking the computer by going back and forward. Oh, we'll just stick with this. So these are some examples of trees utilising shared root soil volumes or soil systems. And sure, whilst there's some tree stunting and maybe not some optimal results in Gwilym and Ross's mines, and the question time might be quite interesting, I believe that the overall visual effect is really useful, and the shade provided on a linear plane provides the desired outcome. So the soil volume simulator creates a range of volumes depending on the factors that you enter into the simulator. So we want you to use this as a tool to argue for greater soil volumes where factors like maintenance is reduced, or explain tree stunting, and to discuss longevity and replacement planting lifespans. How can you use this? Use this soil volume simulator as a backup when trying to, so I'm thinking councils here now, when trying to justify for funding or obtaining maintenance budgets. Use it as a tool to demonstrate achieving canopy cover through faster tree growth via larger soil volumes, or by better maintenance, or by irrigation. Use it to advocate for larger growing native tree species, or for demonstrating the urban heat effect versus stunted tree growth. Use the soil volume simulator when assessing development applications, such as to condition for connected soil routing zones, or doing that via stratovolts, or just plainly justifying or arguing for larger soil volumes or larger growing tree species. And also use it in forecasting tree replacement timings and obtaining appropriate budgets for replanting. And finally, if there's one takeaway from the whole day, just this presentation, don't be afraid to plant larger growing native trees. Thanks.